All right, so let's get going with applications. One of the questions we get a lot is, I've already filled out this application. I put all this information into their website. Why do I have to repeat all that information when I put together a resume? And it's a good question. It's a valid question. And it's really important to understand why we put it in both, the majority of that information in both. I've had people come to me and say, hey, you know what? I don't want to waste space on my resume with things I've already put on my application. So I'm just going to put my work history on the application, and I'm going to put all the skills that I bring from that work history on my resume. And I believe that's a mistake. The reason is, an application and a resume are often seen separately. They're seen by different people. Sometimes a business may have, in many cases, something called an applicant tracking system. It's just a computer program that looks at resumes and looks at applications, looks for keywords, and if those keywords match their job posting, words that are in their job posting, then that application may be brought up to the next level. When it's brought up to that next level, the person seeing your application and resume usually just see your resume. When people are interviewing you, they're looking off your resume, not your application and resume, which I get is a little confusing. It's not in all cases. In some cases, they're going to see both. But the reason I say that is you need to speak to both audiences. The resume needs to stand on its own as a marketing piece towards why you're relevant to this job. And if you don't have employment history on your resume, someone's going to look at that resume and wonder why they're seeing your resume. And they may have some preconceived notions of how relevant you are to this position because they're not seeing the transferable skill sets, they're not seeing the work history. So make sure that your resume and application are good marketing pieces. The way I like to look at it, though, is an application is a filtering device from the employer standpoint. That's why they ask questions like, why did you leave your last job? A resume is a marketing piece from your standpoint. It's telling all the really good things that you can offer an employer. Now, some of the same information is going to be in both, but they are slightly different documents with slightly different purposes. On applications, it's really important to read the instructions carefully. I'm not saying anyone is trying to trick you. In the past, there have been employers that have done weird things with instructions, like they say at the beginning, read all instructions before beginning application. And at the very end, the last instruction is only fill out the first page, something like that. I think that's kind of silly myself, but in the past, you might have heard some, stories about employers doing that. That's not why I say read instructions carefully. The reason I say read instructions carefully is even within a completely honest application, everyone is different, and therefore their instructions might be slightly different. So read them through thoroughly and fill it out completely. Leaving something blank just because you don't think it relates or you don't want to answer it, in many cases will get your application rejected. There's been many instances in which someone has told me, I was so qualified for this job, I have no idea why they wouldn't consider me. I can't imagine someone more qualified. And we look at their application and they left something blank. In today's application process, it's harder to do that actually, because when you fill something out online and you don't complete it, you'll get a little red mark that says this must be filled out before you can submit, which is to our advantage. So putting something like not applicable or something like that in a section in which maybe they ask you for volunteer work that you don't have any, or advanced degrees and you don't have any, or extra certificates that you don't have. Sometimes they allow you to just not choose that section, but if there's a place that you have to fill something in, make sure you're doing that. All right. Keep good records too. It's really important to keep good records, because if you don't, you won't be able to fill out an application correctly. I'm not saying you're being dishonest by it. It's just that when you fill out an application with incorrect dates, that can come back to hurt you, especially if you're filling out an application for government work. So Ben and I both work for the state of Minnesota. And the state of Minnesota is very, very specific about what constitutes acceptable work history. So let's say that I was applying for a job that needed 2 years of employment history in a specific industry. If I say that I worked from 2011 to 2012, I may say to myself, hey, that's 2 years. From an employer standpoint, that's 2 days. They give you only what they can prove. So that they would give you from January 31st of 2011 through December 31st of 2011 through January 1st of 2012. They're not doing that to be mean. They're doing it because that's all that can be proven. So keep really good records. Sometimes you're not going to give the exact date. In most cases, you're not. But sometimes it'll be important to have months, but certainly have the correct years. And I know that can be difficult to find. So once you get that information, make sure that you're capturing it and you're keeping it in a good place, a good record keeping place. Emailing it to yourself would be a very simple way of doing that, as long as you put a title of maybe application dates or employment dates, so you can search for that later. I use something called Google Drive or even OneDrive from my Microsoft account. It's just an online storage option. I'll be sending everyone a record keeping spreadsheet or fillable, what's called a PDF, where you can put all of your employment history on there, and then you can save that. Just make sure you put it in a good place so you don't have to look it up again. Calling former employers is one way of finding employment dates. Sometimes that's not an easy discussion to have, but it's worth it. Also, there are some additional options through the Social Security Administration, but that can cost money. So it's much better to call former employers. If they're closed, there's sometimes where you do your best guess, but I would always guess conservatively, so that at the very worst, you're giving yourself less credit than you deserve, not more credit, because employers can dismiss someone if they lied on their resume. In many cases, it's not purposeful, the resume or their application. It's just because we didn't take the time to look it up. All right. So the main gist of today is talking about resumes. So we're going to go over the different types of resumes and understand the key basics, the sections, the importance of targeting your resume, and then the formatting choices that we make or choose not to make. Formatting is the first thing people notice about a resume. Unfortunately, they notice how it looks, and sometimes we over format a resume, and it actually detracts instead of enhances a resume. And finally, we'll talk briefly about the importance of sending a cover letter and the basic content to include. So let's just pause just for a moment. Ben, are there any questions we need to get to before we jump into resumes?
Does look like we would want to once again talk about letting UI know that they're attending these meetings. There's a question I've done the same. Do they know that we are attending these meetings?
Only if you log into your UI account and mark today's date under that topic. So if the creative job search were something that you said you were going to do, all you have to do is log into your account, your UI account, and that's not something we can do for you, even if we wanted to. And then look at your I'm trying to think of the name for it. Your job search activities, and put today's date under that job search activity. If creative job search wasn't something you said you were going to do, wasn't on your job search, I mean, I'm glad you're here, but you wouldn't have to mark that off, okay? I do take attendance from my standpoint that just says that, hey, we serve this many people. That's our attendance portion, but the UI portion is something you do yourself. Any other questions before we move on, Ben?
There's actually several questions here, but I'll only ask one. How can I supply a cover letter on an application system that only allows a single attachment? Typically the resume, which then populates the application.
My take on cover letters, and no one wants to hear this is do it no matter what. Sometimes you'll be able to do it as part of your attachment to your application. Sometimes they don't allow it. You know, every application is different. So if they don't allow it, sometimes you do it as part of an email. There are email cover letters. Sometimes it's just not at that point you can't do it. So what I do then is if I get to the interview, I bring a cover letter. And the reason I do this is it's a work sample. It's an effective way of showing that I can put together a business letter. I brand it with my resume, meaning that I have the same font, the same margins, the same heading. and I include it. And that is a lot of work. By the way, I'm not dismissing that. And in many cases, your cover letter might not even be read. But my thought is, if I'm competing against 5 other people in an interview that are equally qualified to me, what can I do to elevate my chances? And the answer I always give to that is, I'm willing to do what someone else is not willing to do. I'm going to put that extra effort into it, because I don't get a whole lot of interviews. We don't. We apply for a lot more jobs than we interview for. If you're applying for a job you really want, I would put together a cover letter if they allow it. If you get an interview for a job you really want, even if they don't ask for a cover letter, you can include one and you can hand it to them at the interview. I've done it before, and it's created an impression. So as far as resumes, there are many different strategies. You're going to hear a lot of things from me today that are my opinion. I'll try to do things based solely on what I've seen has been successful, but other people have had successes with resumes that are different than what I would recommend. That doesn't mean they're wrong or I'm right or vice versa. It just means that in the end, we're going to provide you what we call best practices. And that is, we discuss these things with employers every single day. And based on the feedback on what their expectations are and what we've seen as successful for job seekers, we're going to give you those thoughts. I've seen someone write a resume out on a napkin and get a job. I've seen people write a resume out in crayon that was effective. Now, would I recommend that? Absolutely not. It doesn't mean it wouldn't work. But in the end, hedge your bets. You use the best practices. The bottom line is, you have to be comfortable with it. You have to be able to sell it. Okay. And if you hear conflicting opinions, take that in. You don't have to agree with everybody. Consider what works for you. But if it's not working for you, then consider going back to something that's more tried and true, or what we call best practices. So here's an acronym that just allows me to talk a little bit about resumes. They're a review of your qualifications. They're not everything you've ever done for everyone you've ever done it for. The mistake many of us make is we make a resume too long. I'm not going to try to be telling you exactly how long your resume should be, because employers have different expectations. Some employers, many, in fact, I would say most, are looking for a 1 to 2 page resume. But there are certain industries that the expectation is you're going to have a much longer resume, like a project-based resume, or something called a CV, a curriculum vitae. Or maybe it's a academic resume above and beyond that CV. That it's just the expectation that you're going to give them really a proposal for hiring them. You would know that, though, in those industries. In most cases, you want to give them a review, a kind of a teaser of things to come. You want to give them enough information to create interest, but you don't want to give them so much information that they have to filter through things that don't relate. So essential information only. Now, I say skills-based. We're going to be talking about skills-based resumes, but all resumes are skills-based at their core, meaning that they're going to require you, or hope that you have, relevant work history. But more importantly than that, once they see that relevant work history, they want to know what skills were developed within that work history, your successes based on those skills. So it's somewhat easy to get your job history. I mean, that's a process that you go through. The hard part is pulling out those skills that you developed during that work history and marketing them to employers. Now, when I say unique, I don't mean unique in look or in format. That's a mistake that a lot of people make. They say, well, I'm going to stand out and I'm going to make mine very colorful. I'm going to put my picture on it and I'm going to put some graphics on it. In many cases, that will turn off an employer, because they're used to looking at a resume and being able to quickly scan it and get the information they need. So standing out in those cases is not necessarily to your benefit. What I mean by unique is the stories are unique. Your successes are unique. And that's just a natural course of creating a resume. If you're talking about your successes, your stories, they're going to be unique stories. The mistake I've seen way too often is someone downloads a very easily downloadable, what we call template. And I'll be sending you some templates, by the way. Don't use our examples of our skills to market you. I know it's somewhat easy to say, well, I kind of did the same thing. That's fairly close to what I did. And it's a lot less work for me to just go with this, because they have it worded so nicely. Take the extra time, get some assistance. You can reach out to your local career force location through email, through the telephone. We're closed in most cases physically, but we are open virtually. I will give everyone a list of all the contact numbers for the career force locations throughout the state. I really recommend you get as much of your resume together as possible and then have someone review it. It can be us, it could be a friend, it could be one of your references. I think that's a really good tactic to use, having one of your references read through your resume and give you feedback on it. So the uniqueness comes through your own stories. And that's what's going to separate you, both in a resume and in an interview, by the way. If I've interviewed a lot of people and I get really tired of hearing the same stories. I call them the internet stories. The internet stories for, tell me about your greatest weakness. And I've heard, well, I'm a perfectionist. I just want to do, that's just who I am. And so I'll work late or come in on weekends because the customer is number one for me. That may be true in any given situation, but because I've heard it so many times, it goes in that category of that's not a unique story. I've heard it too many times. So come up with something that's uniquely you, that you're passionate about, that you're really good at, and you're going to stand out. So it is a marketing product, as I mentioned. Now, no matter what advice you're getting from anybody, myself included, if your resume is not effective, you need to change it. You need to alter your approach or who you're marketing yourself to. If you have an awesome resume, but you're marketing yourself to the wrong audience, it's not an effective resume. If you're marketing yourself to the correct audience, jobs that you are qualified for, but you're not getting any bites, then you need to think about how could I change this resume to be more effective as a marketing piece. And we can help in those situations. So if you're kind of, running up against a wall, if you're just not getting any interviews or any bites on your resume, have someone take a quick look at it. We become too close to our resumes before we even finish them. And by that, I mean, we can't look at them objectively because we've lived it. We know what we want to say, and we make some certain assumptions that an employer will not see. They will not get it because they don't know you. So it's a really good idea to have your resume looked at for multiple reasons, and that's one of them. And then here's the one thing I want to be very careful about how I explain it, because it scares a lot of people. Your resume needs to be specific to each and every job you apply for. I do not mean that after you put on all this work, these hours, sometimes weeks of work, that you have to rewrite your entire resume just because you're applying for another similar job. All I mean is look at that job posting. Look for the words they use. Look for the skills they've identified as being the most important. And then you slightly alter your resume, you slightly edit it to relate to their needs, okay? Now, it's very rare that the same exact resume would be used twice, but it's also very rare that you'll spend more than 5-10 minutes altering that resume to that new job. When you go across to different industries, then you're going to make some bigger adjustments. So, obviously, if you've done bartending in the past, and now you want to work in let's say in manufacturing, those are two different resumes. But each bartending resume will be slightly adjusted to a new bartending opportunity, just like a new manufacturing job will be slightly altered to a new manufacturing opportunity. It is a lot of work, but the more you put into it, the less time it takes to get a job in most cases. So I did mention it's a preview of coming attractions. The coming attractions would be in an interview. And right before we get to Ben, I'm just going to reinforce the goal of a resume is to get you an interview. It's not to get you a job. We wouldn't be writing a resume if we weren't looking for a job. I get that in most cases. But think of the resume as having the goal of getting you to the interview. Yes, Ben?
There are several questions here. I'll just get off a couple of them here. One, how much does COVID layoff impact work history with prospective employers, especially if you weren't brought back on?
Okay, great question. Great question. It's a question we get just about every single time we on any workshop because it's top of people's mind. There are many people who have been laid off due to COVID, and it's something to them, and they have a year or more of unemployment on there. Here's the good news. Employers see that by the hundreds every day. Almost every resume they're looking at has a gap in employment. It's like no time in the past is that as acceptable as it is right now. Don't lie about it. If you were fired from a job and it wasn't COVID, don't say it was COVID. but don't worry about a gap in employment due to COVID. Employers are not, there are over 100,000 jobs currently on minnesotaworks.net. Ben and I hear from employers every day, either through the grapevine or directly, that they're really struggling to get people. And every one of the people they hire is likely to have had a long layoff. So that's a good question, but I would tell you not to worry about it as much as you would have in the past. We'll take one more question.
I am hearing impaired and required accommodations. Is this something I should address in a cover letter?
So in those cases, that's a great situation in which you would contact your local career force location to have a one-on-one conversation, because that is a disclosure question that is very specific to each individual person and each individual opportunity. And I don't even want to get too much in the weeds in this, because I would be making a lot of assumptions and giving you any recommendations on this. If you have specific questions, contact your local career force location. And we do have at every location access to rehabilitation services staff that specialize in accommodations. If it's an accommodation required or needed for an interview, specifically for the interview, there are some options above and beyond asking the employer. There's some things we can do on our end of it or on your end of it. But again, that's a very specific question that I don't want to make assumptions on. All right, let's take another look. So what you're seeing here right now is just a graphic, just kind of fun to have graphics once in a while. And what we call this is a heat chart. This image comes from theladders.com. It's showing a recruiter's eyeballs, and I don't know who had their eyeballs hooked up to a heat sensor, but the idea is to show where this person's attention was centered. When an employer looks at your resume, you want them to get the whole picture. You want them to get to everything they need to get to. And if you look at this one on the left, you can see that they spent the majority of their time on the top third here. The reason they didn't get down to here is look how, and I know you can't read this, but look how densely packed this information is. It's really hard. You almost have to engage for a couple minutes to read through all this. And that would be very hard to do if you're looking through a bunch of resumes. The average resume gets looked at for about 17 seconds, the first go around. If you catch someone's attention in those first 17 seconds with something relevant to their needs, they're going to spend more time on it. And if you take a look at this one, you see the heat chart was very, it was up here, but they also jumped down to education. And education might have been important to them. And you do see that education, well, you may be able to see it, is bolded and it's capitalized and it makes it stand out. And so they can jump to that. Here, it's very difficult to jump to any section because nothing stands out. It's all very densely packed text. So we may be talking about this a little later, but anywhere between 10 and 12 point font is what I recommend. That's just the size of your font. If you go any smaller than that, it's really hard to read. If you go any larger than that, you're wasting space, valuable space on your resume. You also want to take a look at your margins. If you have really big margins, that's that white space on the left, right, above, and below, you're again wasting space. So 1 inch is what I recommend. I know it's hard to kind of see where the margins would be on this one for the demonstration purposes, but usually 0.8 inches to 1 inch is what I recommend. Anything less than it, sometimes it won't even print correctly. Anything more, excuse me, and you're just wasting that valuable space. So how do we make our resume? And when I say scannable here, there's two ways of thinking about scannable. You see it says make it scannable. In the past, there were issues where you actually had to scan a printed resume into an employer's tracking system. And that doesn't happen a whole lot. I'm not saying it doesn't happen at all, but it doesn't happen a whole lot anymore. But it is still scannable by the human eye. So when someone is looking at it, and that's what I'm going to focus on here, how do we make it easily scannable for someone to get the information they need in that 17 seconds? So some of the tactics you can use is use bold or capital letters to highlight information. When you go up and down with font size, with the size of your text, it can be really hard to read. And your intent is to make something stand out, and actually what you're doing is you're making it even harder to read. So I usually stick with the same font size throughout my resume, other than my name. The name is usually bigger. But the way I make things stand out is I capitalize them or I bold them. In most cases, you want to avoid italics because that's going to make your resume look a little dated. You can use some underlining, but the borders and the lines across the page, just make sure they don't detract from the scannability of the resume. If it purely enhances and it makes it really look nice and neat, you can use some of that. The one thing I'm going to tell you not to use, though, are text boxes. Text boxes are something that you insert into your document. It makes it very easy to move things around. The problem with that is a lot of we call applicant tracking systems, or the computer program that may look at your resume. They do not look at text boxes in the same way as they look at regular text. Tables in most cases are fine. We do get this question quite a bit. I don't like tables personally. They're very hard to format, but they are what a lot of the templates that you get from Microsoft Word or anything online would be based on. So I've never run into a situation in the last 10 years in which an employer couldn't look at something within a table effectively. Be very careful of graphics or color. In most cases, that's going to detract or not meet the expectations of an employer. If it is an expectation, you're going to know that. I've worked with a lot of graphic designer resumes. Those are tricky ones because the expectation is just really a work sample, but they still have to be readable. And I've seen some doozies that were so graphically intensive, you couldn't get heads or tails out of what they were trying to say. And then color, even though you see color on some of the templates, I generally stay away from color. So resumes at their basics are a selling tool. So you do have to be honest and positive. This is not usually an issue on a resume. It's more of an issue on an application where someone would maybe talk poorly about a former employer. But on a resume, it should only be honest things. You should never be talking badly about coworkers or clients, is where I've seen it happen a few times. You really want to focus on your positive accomplishments. What impact have you had in this job? Ideally, you've got some numbers in there someplace. And I know this can be difficult in different situations and different industries, but if you can get percentages or dollar signs of some sort, some numeric value, that really stands out on a resume. And it does two things. One, the eye is drawn to numbers on a resume, but two, it's an attempt to prove a skill set rather than just say you can do something. So if I said, I increased the net worth of my company while I was there. Okay, that's great. But if you said, I increased the bottom line of my company by 23% through effective internet ads focusing on social media, that tells an employer a whole bunch of information, and it shows the outcome of that skill set, what it meant to that employer. Now, you have to be honest about that, of course. Don't inflate information. There are times where maybe you make phone calls. If you make phone calls, talk about the volume of phone calls you made. If you made very few phone calls, talk about the length of time or the closed business based on those phone calls. So even though we're being completely honest, we can use different numbers that that benefit us, as long as they're true. Sometimes we use percentages because that's a better number. Sometimes we use dollar signs because that's the better number. Based on your industry, there will be different tactics for that. But at least attempt to get some numbers in there. And then every resume, and I repeat this over and over again, is targeted to each position. Now, we do get quite a few questions about, I'm applying for a bunch of jobs that I'm way overqualified for. Why aren't they asking me to come in for an interview? And you answered your own question there. If you're overqualified, then it's not targeted. And I know that seems like a contradiction a little bit. Let me give you an example. If you're applying for a job that's more entry level and you're talking about your management experience, we're going to be honest. We're going to talk about, we're going to give the job titles we had, but we're going to focus on what they need, not what we are proud of. The reason employers do not want to hire someone who's overqualified it's not because they're trying to discriminate in almost all cases. It's because they have been burnt by that in the past. They've hired someone who was way overqualified, and as soon as they hired and trained that person in, they moved to a job that was more in line with their work history, with their former wage. And that employer has lost out on that training dollars. That return on investment hasn't been there. So now they got to start the process all over again. And I've run into this myself. I've talked to a lot of employers, and it's based on their experience. So are there reasons for someone who's overqualified for a job to be very happy in entry level? Absolutely. I've worked with a lot of people in that situation too. But the way they get their foot in the door, the way they get to prove to an employer that they are interested in this job at this wage, at this part in the time in their career, is they market to the position they're applying for, not to the last job they held. And that really is hard to cut some things off your resume that are really great. Again, if they're not targeted to the needs of the employer, they're not doing you any good. I'll also be sending everyone a really nice handout that was put together on dealing with issues of overqualification, and that'll go out in tomorrow's email. As we switch to the next slide, I'll let Ben ask a couple more questions here.
We have one question here about the targeting. I would like to ask how you can alter a resume in 5 to 10 minutes to match keywords used in the job description. It takes me at least 30 to 45 minutes to make sure that the terminology is placed accurately and effectively. Just want to understand realistic expectations or tips on how to do it.
So, great question. In certain situations, absolutely, it's going to be 30 to 40 minutes. It could be a whole day. In other situations, it can be just a few minutes because you're applying for very similar type of work. I'll give you an example. I worked a lot in the Northeast area. There's a lot of medical industries in the Northeast, a lot of hospitals. So we have 2 local employers in my area that both hire for RN jobs. Now, if you're an RN, your resume is going to be very similar to applying for either one of those positions at either one of those hospitals, but the terminology they use is slightly different. So what I do is I look for, am I using the same words that they're using on their job posting? There is a free job scan. I'll include the link in the email, in which you can match your resume against a job posting. It's a paid service, but you get a couple free ones per month or whatever. I'm not exactly sure. There are a couple free ones, and it'll kind of show you, here's how much your resume matches this job posting. If it's good to go and it's just a light look over, that can take 5 to 10 minutes. But you're absolutely right. You should spend the time, if you need to adjust your resume to the needs of that employer. If that takes 30 minutes, that takes 40 minutes, absolutely take that time to do it. In my mind, effective job search is quality over quantity. That doesn't mean you wait for the perfect, absolutely perfect job, but it also means you don't apply for 10, 20 jobs a day. You're applying for the jobs you're truly interested in getting, and you are putting a good effort into doing that. One more question.
If you were terminated from a position, how would you word that information on your application?
Involuntary separation. Quick and easy answer. Don't go into any of the details. You will be asked about it if you get an interview, so be prepared. Talk through it with someone like a career force specialist. Explain the whole situation, and then we help you strip out the emotion from it and come up with an answer that tells the truth, that doesn't hurt you, and allows you to move forward. Why employers are asking that question is they're wondering, will it affect me? So we come up with a tactic to explain what happened and why is it an issue going forward. You cannot do that effectively on an application. So my best advice is involuntary separation. All right, resume basics. Choose a format. We'll go over the 3 formats very quickly here. Everyone will get an example in the follow-up. The top third of your resume is what I call prime real estate. It's the most important. So you choose the format that allows you to talk about the most important information on the top third. You're in a very relevant, if you're applying for a very relevant job to your most current work history, you're probably going to use the chronological resume because your most recent job is in the top third of your resume, and they can look at it and quickly, easily see the transferability of those skills. If you have had or transferring to another industry, you might go to a skills-based resume, or functional, or even a combination resume. Whatever one you use, you want to include white space. You don't take a 3-page resume and cram it onto 1 page by decreasing your font and margins. You want enough white space, that's the margins and the space in between sections, so the eye can be drawn to certain parts. If you don't have enough white space, it looks like one big glob of text. Also, you want to make sure your resume is error-free. I've looked at thousands of resumes, and I don't know of one that the first time I looked at it didn't have an error. Now, some of these are really nitpicky. They're things like, things weren't lined up correctly, or the hyphens look different, and they're really small things. But remember, everyone who's applying for these jobs should be qualified. And employers are looking for reasons to filter down to a decent job pool, a decent interview pool. And mistakes on a resume can have a really unfortunate effect on taking someone out of consideration for a job they're otherwise well qualified for. And that's the one thing we can control, by the way. We don't control much in our job search because a lot of people are looking at our information and making decisions. We can control what we're putting out there, though. And having an error-free resume is a process. It takes time. I always say on time is better than perfect, but you're working towards that road to getting that really good resume that's error-free. Once you've done that, the edits are hopefully going to just slightly altering that resume, and it's not going to create a bunch of issues, and you're going to be in a good place to react to opportunities very quickly once you get that good error-free resume put together. So the different formats, we talked a little bit about chronological. That's just organized by job history. That's the standard resume people have been using for ever and ever. It's still a very relevant resume. In many cases, it's still the resume employers prefer. And the reason for that is it allows them to see who has the most relevant and current work history. COVID considerations aside, I mean, because a lot of people have a gap in work history, but if you have, within the last couple of years, very relevant work history, you want to go with chronological because it says, I have recently done what you're asking me to do or something similar. A functional or skills-based resume is organized by skills. So if you've done work history that maybe isn't as obvious to an employer how it would transfer, you make the case for them. You spell it out for them by showing them the skills that transfer from your position. So when they see that work history, possibly at the bottom, they're going to understand better. They're not going to have those preconceived notions of what that title meant. Also, if you've been out of work for, let's say, quite a while, let's say 5 years, a functional or skills-based resume is very good at showing the benefit before they see the potential red flag of, why were they out of work. You've already created interest before you create any questions, okay? The functional or skills-based in combination are more similar today than they've ever been. And the reason I say that, I'll show you some examples here. So this right here is the chronological resume, and very little white space simply because we're trying to show you as much as we can on this page. You can even have some information at the beginning of it that talks about, some skills summaries or whatever, but then you're going to have your work history, and you're going to have, in most cases, your start and end date on the right-hand side because employers are used to seeing them there. So they're going to be right aligned on that other side. You're going to bold your most recent job title or your job title, and then your employer comes second. That's sometimes beneath it. The reason we talk about the job ahead of where we did it is that's in most cases more important. It's more important what you did than where you did it. There are situations in which you would reverse those, but those are very specific. On a case-by-case basis. And you can even add additional things like volunteer work, and then your education is almost always at the bottom unless you are more recently graduated from and that's your experience. So let's say I have no engineering experience, but I have an engineering degree. That's going to be at the very top because that's the most important. Education is always important, but sometimes it's just a tick mark. It's what you've done since you got that degree that they're going to focus most of their time on, because that's the real world lived experience of a job seeker or an employee. A functional resume has changed a little bit over the years. We used to use it for people who had been returning from work from, maybe 20 years off. They're returning to work after the kids went back to school. And in those cases, we wouldn't have the education, or excuse me, the employment wouldn't be included at all, like in this case here. But even in a functional resume, if you have employment history, even if it was a few years ago and unrelated, some employers are still looking for that employment history. So in a functional or combination resume, it's almost all about skills, but you can even add a little bit about your employment history on the bottom there. We'll go through one more before we get to some questions. And then the last example is a combination resume, which is really a combination of skills and chronological. You know, you have relevant work history, but you really want to stress the skills that were developed during that work history. So you talk about them at the top, and then you put your work history at the bottom. Now, the difference between a combination and a current functional may be a little bit vague. Don't worry about the titles. Very few employers are saying, send me a combination resume. They're saying, send me your resume. You use whatever format works best for you. Don't get too wound up about, you know, does this exactly fit the definition of a functional or combination or chronological. The most well-defined is a chronological, but just use whatever works for you. Ben, was there a couple questions?
We have a couple questions here, basically asking variations of how long should the resume be?
Okay.
As in, how many years should I go back?
Oh, great question. Yep. And Ben's going to combine a lot of the questions because a lot of them are similar. 10 to 15 years is the general rule. 10 to 15 years. Now, when I say general rule, that means there's exceptions to this. There's exceptions to everything I'm going to tell you. So if you have very relevant work history, that you still have skill sets that are still, you know, skill sets that you've maintained, but that job was 20 years ago, you make the determination. Would it benefit me more to add it or leave it off? Now, the reason that we only go 10 to 15 years back is we want to show them what's relevant, what we have most recently done, and what we've kept up on with skills. Also, we don't want to show things like I've worked since the early 80s. Putting that on my resume, it's something that I've done. It's a skill set I've developed. It helped me in my career, but it doesn't help me in my resume because it makes my resume too long, and it starts to hint at I'm no longer in that 30 to 40 year age range. There's nothing wrong with being the age I'm at, but remember, a resume is just to market you. They should never be questioning, you know, is this person going to work for very much longer? Who knows what their preconceptions are? All they're really looking for is someone who could do the job. I can do that by showing my more recent work history. As far as I like a one-page resume, I try to make a one-page resume, but in most cases I fail and I ended up going on to 2 pages. The idea is if the most important things are on page 2, that's not an effective resume. Change the format. If the most important information you have ends up on the 2nd page, then change the format to something that allows you to front end that information. I would argue in most cases against anything over 2 pages, although industry-specific expectations may dictate that you have to create a larger resume, but you would know that. Let's take one more question, Ben, before we move on, if there is one.
Can you please explain how to list the same job title at different companies without copying and pasting duties?
Okay, perfect. I love this question. In fact, gives me an opportunity to say I will be sending you a resume, an extra resume template that shows you a whole bunch of different ways that we can like explain long-term employment. So if you worked with one employer for 20 years, and you only want to go back 10 years, they'll show you some ideas for that. Or if companies combined and you want to show longevity, and not make it look like you're a job jumper from 4 different jobs when in effect it was the same employer. But specifically to your question, let's say you did housekeeping at for a hotel. The mistake a lot of people make is they will list housekeeping, this hotel, housekeeping, this hotel, and they'll copy and paste the same exact information to all 4 positions. The key is, remember, we want them to see the most important things first. So even though you did the same things at all jobs, you list the most important things based on the job description you're applying to, and you front end them to the most recent position. And then you still list additional things you can do, maybe even if it's not something that they're specifically requesting, but you know to be part of the job as additional skills or additional successes or whatever under the jobs that were a little further back. Okay, I love that question because it's a common mistake that people make. And again, if you're going to quantify things, spend the most time quantifying the most recent. So I cleaned so many rooms per day, had satisfaction rate of so much, whatever that should happen to be. But front end, the most important information first. So just some basic parts of a resume. We've gone through some of this, but on the heading, we've got our name. We usually put that a little larger, bold, capitalize it sometimes. I do usually spell out Minnesota. You don't have to, but if you're not going to spell out Minnesota or Wisconsin or whatever, use the two initial state like capital M, capital N. There's no periods. I see that a lot. You don't have to put your home phone and your cell phone. In most cases, just putting your cell phone number without listing it as a cell phone number, whatever one you use, just put that one there. Sometimes people want to put their home phone and they'll put it as office or whatever. That'd be fine, but make sure that you are checking those. As someone who has a currently filled voicemail on my landline, that would not be an effective job search strategy if an employer called that. And by the way, this happens a lot. Employers call people and it says, this voicemail has not been set up. This voicemail is not accepting calls. You're not on the approved list. All of those stop your chances with an employer. They won't go any further than that. So make sure that you call, know what your voicemail says, and change it to a professional voicemail, at the very least, through your job search time in job search. Make sure that you have a professional email address. That may mean that you create a new one. They're free. Gmail and Outlook are the two most relevant ones, or two most professionally sounding ones. Usually just your name in some form. You can put middle initials in there if your name is already used, or change the first and last name. It might take you up to 20 minutes to develop a new professional email account, but check it daily and make sure that it represents what they would see on that name. So if the name is up here, it should be something very similar to that name in their email address. So don't put hobbies or fun things that you do. We all have those email addresses. You can have multiple. Use a professional one. If you have a completed LinkedIn account, by completed I mean that you're at the all-star status. You're at a point where you have a certain amount of connections, and that you've completed your profile, and it's something you want to market about yourself, then include it. But a lot of people, just get onto LinkedIn, immediately put their LinkedIn address on their resume. You don't have to have LinkedIn to apply. You don't have to have LinkedIn on your resume, but if you do, it should be a complete, effective marketing piece that gives an employer more information, because that's the purpose, is to develop additional interest. And if they click on that link or go to that link and it detracts from the overall impression they had before, just leave it off. You don't have to have LinkedIn on your resume. Next part is objective, and I get a lot of questions about this. Objective is kind of something that was used in the past. You don't have to have it on your resume. I choose in most cases not to, but if I do, and I occasionally do, I will put objective. I'll put the title of the job I'm applying to. So at the very least, I have customized that part of it. And so I'd put mechanical engineer position found on company website ID 74389. That tells an employer why they're looking at your resume. If it's printed off and on their desk, remember, once it's printed off, it's separated from the application completely. And it immediately tells them, why am I looking at this? And then it also tells them where their marketing has been successful. It gives them some feedback. I didn't find this off Indeed. I didn't find it off Craigslist. I found it right on your company website. If employers are getting qualified candidates from their employee website, they may choose to shift their marketing or their expenditures to outside job posting sites. So it's not a bad idea to do that. It only takes up a line. You can put a summary in here that will explain, maybe it'll quantify your years in the industry. It kind of gives them a jump start of here's what you're going to find. Make sure you're not using someone else's words there and you're not wasting words. So seeking in a rewarding career in an industry leading employer where I can develop my skill sets. That is a bunch of words that don't say anything about what you have to offer. So make sure everything on your resume has a purpose. If it doesn't, if it's just flowery words, you can delete it in most cases. Just because it's on a template or pre-exists on something you had before doesn't mean you have to keep it. Use that valuable space to talk maybe more about your skill sets, about your job history. Add a couple bullets to your job history. We usually start with a active verb. So we don't say I, we don't put any pronouns in there. Design the plan layout for the shipping department. If you can quantify that, design the plan layout for the shipping department, increasing effectiveness or decreasing returns by 20%. If you can quantify that and it's honest, that will stand out. Now, in a chronological resume, you're going to list these skill sets or these skill statements under your job title. In a skills base, you're going to put them, excuse me, I was looking at the wrong thing here. Here's the example of where you would have a skill statement under a position. In a functional resume, you might have it underneath a qualification statement. So this isn't tied to a particular job. It's just an overall, here are my engineering qualifications. This works very well if your employment history isn't current on engineering. Maybe you had a sidetrack in your career and you did something else for a while, like sales. Well, you're applying for an engineering job, so you don't want them to see sales experience as the first thing. Another thing you'd have on here is education. If it's within the last 5 years, I put the dates on it. Usually I leave the dates off after that. Do get some questions about, should I put my GPA? If you've got 3.8 to 4.0, sure, put it on there if you want to. There's nothing wrong with a 3.0 or any GPA because it's all specific to what you took and how hard it was and that sort of thing. However, people who generally put their GPA are going to be listing 4.0. And if you say to an employer that all these people have 4.0, but I have significantly less than that, nothing wrong with that, but you don't need to put it on there. Okay. Again, that's totally up to you, but that's just my recommendation, I guess. Some other things you can include are military experience. I highly recommend you put that in there if you have served. There is a real thing called military preference, and I know employers all over the state that are looking to hire veterans, so put it on there, no matter how far back it was. You can leave dates off if you think it's going to be a problem, but put your military experience in there. If all of your experience is military, reach out to a vets rep at one of the local career force locations to what we call demilitarize your resume. And that's not something I'm going to get a whole bunch into, but there are civilian terms for military actions that are going to be create the transferable skills ability for employers to see, oh yeah, I need that. If you put them in strictly military terms, they're not going to be able to understand it. You can also put volunteer experience if it's relevant, leadership experience. Again, everything on here should have a purpose. If it doesn't have a purpose, spend the time and the space on something that does. And in the situations like this, I've had people that will put a half a page of one-day trainings they took. I did the same thing myself. Every month I took a training, and I had to build up CEUs for a type of work I did. Some of them were relevant, some weren't. Even though quite a few were relevant, I just picked and choose the most relevant if I chose to add them at all, because what I really wanted to talk about was work experience. So just because you did it, just because it's relevant, doesn't mean it takes up space on your resume. The most relevant things are put on there. So to spend the last little bit here we have together, just giving you some examples of accomplishment statements. So an accomplishment statement is taking something you did and making it sound or quantifying it to be more impressive than just putting the term. And this is not inflating what we did. This is putting some scope to it, giving some idea of what it meant. So instead of saying kept inventory or called customers, I would say something like managed daily inventory of over 1,000 classifications of medical supplies. That's a very true story. That's a very legitimate number to have for any inventory that's put together, but it's so much better than trying to bulletize maybe 20 things. Here's 20 things I did in 2-letter bullets. I'd rather you flesh out 5 of those bullets to accomplishment statements. Tasks are fine. Sometimes they meet the needs of a keyword search, but once that resume meets a keyword search, it's still got to show value when someone looks at it. And if all they saw were the words directly copied and pasted off their job description or job posting into your resume, it doesn't hold as much value as something like this would. So instead of called customers, you can talk how you grew the client base from 0 to 70 within 2 months by effectively using cold call techniques. That shows a whole bunch of skills. It puts scope to it, and it says you're willing to cold call. You can add several skills into one accomplishment statement. Sometimes you can kind of double or even triple up on what you're marketing about yourself in one phrase. A lot of options here. This is the hardest thing we do in resumes. It's what takes the most time, and it's what you should really focus on once you get your employment history, is what are my successes? How can I effectively market those within a sentence or a line and a half? As far as cover letters, I don't know if I have here. I'll include it in the follow-up. We have a section on the DEED website, Department of Employment and Economic Development website, that gives examples of cover letters. And because we're kind of short on time here, I'm not going to go into it too much. The important part is, if they allow it, I would recommend doing it, because they're saying, I'm giving you an opportunity to market yourself to this job. For someone who doesn't do it, they're going to separate themselves in a negative way from someone who would take the time to do it. Once you get a couple under your belt, they're pretty standard, but it is different than a resume. It is a paragraph. You're completing an idea. You're telling a longer story. So make sure that you spend some time and have those looked at also. We'll take one more question, Ben, before we finish up with the slides. Go ahead.
We just wanted to clarify that you will be answering the questions in the chat that we did not have time to get to in the reply that you're sending out tomorrow. Is that correct?
What I'll be doing is saving the chat, and for the ones that are specific above and beyond what we've done in the content, I can respond directly to those. I'm not going to send a document with all the questions and answers. So as far as resume, go ahead, Ben.
Yep, no, continue.
Okay, yeah, and thank you for that clarification. As far as resume reviews, the careerforcemn.com has a locator tab. If you click on the locator and put your email, or excuse me, your zip code in there, it will give you the closest CareerForce locations to you. I highly recommend that you develop a relationship with your local CareerForce locations. I live in Twig, Minnesota. There are 2 employers in Twig, Minnesota. Ben lives around the metro area. There are thousands. He's going to have more specific information, as will each CareerForce location CareerForce specialist. They're going to know employers. They're going to know the expectations because they've gotten feedback from employers. So I highly recommend you do that. Also, I'll be sending just a direct list, so you can just look it up that way. We are right at 11 o'clock. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I know there was a lot of questions. I'll take a look at the chat and get to those we weren't able to cover during today's presentation. Remember, next week is the interview, one of the most important, in my mind, the most important part of job search. So please join us for that if you are able to. Thank you for your time today, everyone, and I wish you the best of luck in your job search. Have a great day.